Hi, this is Paul. It's been kind of a weird week for me with my on-again, off-again vacation. I'm working on a passage from the book of 2 Kings for Sunday, and it's a very famous story about Hezekiah and his illness. And as I was thinking about that passage and working on that passage, I thought a lot about the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris conversations. One of the fascinating things about listening to those bootleg recordings, and again, I'm really looking forward to the better recordings coming out because you'll be able to hear it all much better. It'll be much better to listen to. But one of the things that I keep thinking about when I listen to these conversations is what exactly is the concern and the offense that the celebrity or career atheists have, and why Jordan Peterson makes them so nervous. Now you can find the mouthy Buddha's take on why Jordan Peterson is taking fans away from Sam Harris, and there's a significant overlap in their community, and I know that from experience. But I always try to, as well as I can, really figure out where the emotional reaction comes from on the part of the atheists against religion, and why. And this is something that fascinates me nearly endlessly, and I've done a lot of thinking about it over the years. And as I was thinking about the conversations between them and this passage in Hezekiah, just one morning, I usually work on my PowerPoints early in the morning, or my videos of this. I get up first thing in the morning and just take my thoughts and try to distill them down. And it just had a whole range of thoughts about this, and I put them all together and I dumped them all in here. So this is gonna be kind of Sam Harris meets the Hezekiah story, and this Hezekiah story is going to be enormously reactive for a lot of atheists because it has so many of the elements that just really upset them. So let's run through the story, because it's not a story that many of you probably know. Hezekiah was one of the last great kings of the southern nation Judah. And if you're following my Sunday series and my Sunday sermons, we're leading up to that. And last week I preached about Hezekiah, and this week I'll preach about this text, although I'm still working on the sermon. I don't really have a rough draft, and my schedule this week is a little bit wonky. So I'm not sure I'll get a rough draft out or how that will go this week, but we'll see. But this is a fairly famous story. It's a story about Hezekiah's illness. And it goes like this. In those days Hezekiah became ill and was at the point of death. The prophet Isaiah, son of Amoz, went to him and said, "This is what the Lord says. Put your house in order, because you are going to die. You will not recover." Hezekiah turned his face to the wall and prayed to the Lord, "Remember, Lord, how I have walked before you faithfully, and with wholehearted devotion have done what is good in your eyes." And Hezekiah wept bitterly. Before Isaiah had left the middle court, the word of the Lord came to him. "Go back and tell Hezekiah, the ruler of my people, this is what the Lord, the God of your father David, says. I have heard your prayer and seen your tears, and I will heal you. On the third day from now you will go up to the temple of the Lord, and I will add 15 years to your life, and I will deliver you and this city from the hand of the king of Assyria. I will defend this city for my sake and for the sake of my servant David." Now right this is exactly the kind of story that Sam Harris wants destroyed and never remembered and not believed in, because here we have a king basing his status and relationship on God, on his moral performance, and this God listening to him and hearing his prayer, and just everything about this story this is exactly the kind of thing that the celebrity atheist says, this needs to go away. And in fact, the story even gets worse. Then Isaiah said, "Prepare a poultice of figs." And it's like, well, if God's going to heal him, why bother with the figs? They did this and applied it to the boil, and he recovered. So is all this God stuff imaginary? Was it the figs that healed him? Is this whole story made up? Or, there was a King Hezekiah, and he's a historical figure. We have evidence of him from the Chronicles of Assyria and from other sources. And maybe, you know, the whole thing was just you had this series of events, and they used a made-up story, and here he got well, and he lived 15 more years, and boom, this kind of thing this is all the worst kind of things that atheists hate about religious stories and religious people who believe in them. And then it even gets worse, because Isaiah answered, "This is the Lord's sign to you, that the Lord will do what he promised." What, Hezekiah doesn't believe him? Shall the shadow go forward 10 steps, or shall it go back 10 steps? It is a simple matter for the shadow to go forward 10 steps, said Hezekiah. Rather, it should go back 10 steps. Then the prophet Isaiah called on the Lord, and the Lord made the shadow go back 10 steps. It had gone down the stairway of Ahaz. And it's like, what? Now God makes the sun go back? You know, or, you know, maybe there was an eclipse, or you know, you can go forever, but the imagined universe of the story is exactly what the atheists object to. And here we have, maybe it's a fable, maybe it's a legend, but this invites people to believe. To believe what? To believe that if I get sick, I can pray, and God might listen to me and heal me. And we don't want people believing this. And we don't want people doing this, because people believing and doing this is the source of all kinds of misery. So you have Jehovah's Witnesses not getting blood transfusions. You've got religious people shaming and other religious people for not believing God. And then you have all the things about, well, you prayed to God and you followed James and you called the elders and you did the anointing with oil, but you weren't healed. And so maybe there's unconfessed sin, and round and round and round. And if, here's the funny thing, I, as a religious person who've been around Christians all my life, Sam Harris knows a little bit of this. I know way, way more of it. And in some senses, my cynicism and my skepticism and my doubt and how I've seen the games played around this. I mean, so on one hand, when I listen to Sam Harris complain about this stuff, I have so many examples of this that I could give Sam Harris and say, I'm with you, Sam. I'm with you, Sam. There's so much charlatanism and foolishness and superstition and on and on and on. And Sam Harris says, it's better to get rid of the whole thing. And I say, no. Well, you just said you know way more about this than Sam Harris knows. Yeah. So why aren't you looking to get rid of this whole thing? Why not box the whole thing up and throw it in the sea and have us all be rational people? And, well, maybe, Pastor, when you pray with someone, they feel a little better, and maybe that helps them psychosomatically and encourages them. And then maybe a tiny little percentage of them gets better because, yes, we're more complex than we know, la-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. But basically, when someone is ill, I send them to a doctor. And if they say, yeah, but I'm going to go to my son, I say, no, go to a doctor who actually went to medical school, who believes in science. And that's what I say, and that's what I do. And then they come at me and with a lot of religious stories and stuff that I consider superstition, and I listen to them, and I have sympathy for Sam Harris. I really do. And so along comes Jordan Peterson, and Jordan Peterson isn't a religious fanatic by any means, and Sam Harris looks at him and says, yeah, you're a little too close to the fanatics. We want a rationalist clean room to set up and get rid of all this religious mumbo-jumbo and religious hocus-pocus and religious superstition and have people deal rationally. And if we could just get rid of all this religious stuff, then rationality would rule and the world would be better and people would stop having religious conflict, so on and so forth. And I listen to that and I'll say, Sam, no, I'm keeping the religion. Well, why? Well, let's run through some things. The first thing I hear from the atheists are the moral objection, that you have a moral duty to disbelieve this story. Now, this is an interesting point that is seldom explored. And if you know a little bit of history, you know that, well, number one, ancient people weren't skeptical or gullible. They knew a lot of foolishness around even if they were far more religious. And if you read the Bible, you can see all kinds of games being played. I listen to this prophet and not that prophet. You know, go back and look at my sermon on King Ahab. And, you know, ancient people were not dumb with respect to this. Read the book of Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar, him putting the screws on his wise men and going to kill them all because they can't tell him his dream. You're supposed to see behind the veil, but you can't do anything as simple as tell me a dream. All of this were known by ancient people. So where does this moral objection come from that says, if you are a religious person, there's a moral failure involved for believing stories like this? Well, where does that come from? Actually, it comes from the Enlightenment, and it comes from John Locke. And some of you know that I've used this course before. I think it's an excellent course, Philosophy and Religion in the West by Philip Carey, who teaches at Eastern University, has a degree from Yale. So yeah, he has a degree from a real university. And he talks about evidentialism, which basically developed with John Locke. And unlike Descartes, Locke's main concern is not with scientific knowledge. He thinks we have very little of that, but with belief. And in a culture where Catholics and a large variety of Protestants think that they do not share their beliefs that those who do not share their beliefs are justly punished in this world and the next, the question is, what ought I believe? Now, what's really interesting about listening to Sam Harris and many of the other atheists is that they put a lot of ought into this belief. It almost becomes a thought crime. Jordan Peterson, you ought not to have religious thoughts. Paul Vanderklay, Pastor Vanderklay, you ought not to be encouraging this kind of thing. Now that's a rather funny thing, this ought on this. So why ought I not? Certainly Sam Harris isn't going to say God is going to hold me accountable in the way that Catholics and Protestants in John Locke's age imagined that God would hold them accountable for their beliefs. So why are you trying to govern what I believe anyway? What made you the thought police? Well, this actually goes back to John Locke. And so what you're saying is that even this evidentialist system that they assume and employ to try and shame religious people out of their belief systems, that itself is a product of the Catholic-Protestant feud, and that itself, in fact, is a product of Christian religion? Oh, do we have the genetic fallacy coming on here? Locke proposes a way of governing and regulating the formation of our beliefs so that we will be doing our duty, doing our best doing our best as limited rational beings to form our beliefs properly. In fact, this entire rational belief admonition that Sam Harris is giving is all based on John Locke. Hence, while Descartes and Locke are both dealing with the anxiety of uncertainty, Locke deals with it by seeking certainty, not by seeking certainty, but by proposing that if we do our best, we shall not be blameworthy by God, even if we come up with the wrong answer. And so here is something that's implicit in the rationalists, is that religious people have a moral failing. But they never pause and reflect on this moral failing. Who's to hold them accountable for this moral failing? Shall we hold each other accountable for this moral failing? What shall be the consequences of this moral failing? How shall the thought police govern this? Now, again, they get very reactive when we start talking about totalitarian communist regimes, where, in fact, they were governing. That's basically what the Soviet Union and what Marxist China did, was try to govern, try to be the thought police to try and get religious thoughts out of people's heads. That's where this goes. Now, God is thought police, but God obviously is imagining a judgment day later and isn't too careful about policing us now. An angel doesn't come and zap me when I have straying religious thoughts. God seems more lenient than the communists. Locke's basic rule for governing our beliefs has been called evidentialism. We should proportion our belief to the strength of the evidence. You've heard that before. In fact, Dillahunty and Harris trot this out almost every time, and Jordan Peterson assumes it too. This has become the dominant moral system governing belief for us today. And it comes from John Locke, and John Locke was a Christian. So the strength of the evidence is to be assessed in terms of new and modern conception of probability. In the Middle Ages, probable meant approved by authority. Now, and I've spoken about this in past videos, evidence is supposed to be empirical, and it's supposed to be public, and it's supposed to be objective. And what we mean by objective is that multiple parties can see it, and it somehow is resistant to our biases to the degree that we can achieve that. And again, this is why we always have difficulty achieving this. And psychology has been dealing with this quite a bit in the last few years. So tells me the psychologists. Empiricism, evidentialism, and religion. John Locke's picture of the self as a dark inner room is a historical descendant of Augustine's picture of the inner self as a place in which we turn to find God. But there's a huge difference. Augustine's inner room is like a courtyard of a palace with no roof or divine light pouring in from above. Locke has put a roof on the inner space of the self. It is not natural to have an inward vision of God there, but only images of the sensible world. Now this gets, there are reasons for that were part of the religious conflict of Locke's day. The crucial evidence on behalf of revealed religion for Locke are the miracles of the gospel, which testify to the truth of the Christian religion. Locke's evidentialist ethic of beliefs thus favors mainstream Christianity and militates against enthusiasm. Enthusiasm was this more emotional, it's something akin to Pentecostalism today, but go back and read stories from the Great Awakenings, read Jonathan Edwards, read that history, and you'll have a sense of the enthusiasm that Locke is talking about. Once evidentialism is widely accepted, however, it will be used in arguments against all religions or against the existence of God in general, something Locke had not anticipated. Thus, evidentialism takes a skeptical turn. And this, in fact, is where we are today, to the degree that these people admonishing evidentialism so stridently, keeping an eye on my phone because I've got messages coming in, those admonishing evidentialism so stridently have completely forgotten the Christian roots of their evidentialism. So what we have in terms of this moral objection is we, in a sense, have an enforced evidentialism. It is social pressure. And in a sense, all the rationalists will group up as a group and say, you're not still believing superstition, are you? You're not still believing religion, are you? They don't actually justify the system itself or even name it. It's simply assumed, and they basically use group pressure and status pressure. We smart people of high status don't believe the superstitious things. Now, if they actually move to another country and were surrounded by other people for whom all of the status is very religious indeed, well, suddenly they would be in the minority, and then we're talking status games. And so what tends to happen in the West is we have this public-private game. People keep their private beliefs in the closet. In public, they're not going to trot out any supernatural story, but in private, baby, they're believing it. They've got their lucky numbers. They're secretly reading the horoscopes. They would be doing all of this, and it's mostly a public shaming exercise, and it doesn't eradicate the pervasive non-evidentialist thinking. You basically drive everyone into the closet, and they won't admit it in public, but they sure will practice it in private. Now, the rationalist dream is that somehow they imagine that this can, through usually public shaming, they can eliminate religious thinking and make people rational. But again, I've never seen them actually articulate a means by which to do so. Now, you can go the East German way and have everybody spying on each other and catching each other in superstitious or religious thinking, but they claim that that's not in their agenda. They want to do this within a free state. Well, go ahead. Good luck. I haven't seen much evidence that it's really worked. It's worked fairly well in public, but not too well in terms of private. There's no evidence that their scheme will actually work, and it really assumes a lot of unfounded assumptions about what rationality is and how it works. And again, go back and see the Ian McGilchrist video, where I think he basically nails rationality when he says rationality is a method or strategy in pursuit of consistency. In other words, you build rationality upon a foundation, but that foundation itself is a presupposition. It's something you bring to the argument. It's not something you derive from the argument. And so therefore things are rational within worldviews. If, for example, you're a Jehovah's Witnesses and you believe that life is in the blood, then it's rational to oppose blood transfusions. One of the huge ironies is that if you look at the anti-vaccination movements, you'll find that these are people with university degrees who have been educated, and now they're out there saying, well, we don't want our children vaccinated because vaccines cause autism. And even by naming this, I am inviting a flood of vax and anti-vax comments in the comment for this video. Vanderklay is taking a stance on vaccinations. You want to know my stance on vaccinations? Vaccinate your children. That's my stance on vaccinations. Vaccinate your children. I just was at the doctor and he did a blood test. It says, oh, you're not immune to measles. So I got a vaccination. I said, why aren't I immune to measles? I got vaccinated as a kid. And the doctor said, well, we thought that, one vaccination was good enough way back in the day when I got vaccinated. Now we know it isn't. Well, that puts skepticism and rationality on science, but we're all working at it. So I go to a regular doctor with a degree on his wall, and he does blood tests, and I take vaccinations. But when you look at the schools that aren't vaccinating, well, these are often middle or upper middle class schools, people with university degrees. And many of these people are not religious at all. And to me, the notion that if you could, and again, they have no program for it, if you could get rid of religious thinking, then suddenly people are going to be rational. And I say, nope. You're going to have them responding to their phobias. You're going to have them responding to their neuroses. You're going to have them responding to whatever ideas they read on the internet. This is how people are. We believe things for reasons of our own, reasons that are idiosyncratic to our experience. Whether or not how you were treated as a child, whether or not you were adopted, the experiences that you had, that you developed from childhood, all of these will weigh into believability or non-believability. And this imagination of a rational universe, to me, is just preposterous. People just don't work this way. So the Rationalist Dream, if you get rid of these ancient stories, then educated people will be unified. No more religious conflict. Hogwash. Watch people fight about vaccinations or immigration or politics. Take the atheists. The atheists can't get together on any page over all of these things. People will suffer less. No more superstition. I doubt it. I watch people suffer from neuroses and phobias and anxieties for all sorts of things. People will bless the world. They'll be more generous. And religious people continue to be more generous than non-religious people. And this is a fact of sociology that gets reinforced again and again and again and again. There's zero, if you want to be an evidentialist, I have seen hardly any reason to imagine that the rationalist dream, the rationalist program, will ever result in that which they say it will result. And my belief in this has everything to do with just watching people and how they make decisions and how they live and what they're anxious about. And I would imagine if Sam Harris were a clinical psychologist sitting in a room and listening to people all day, I think he'd see the same. I think he'd see things the same way. And I think if you talk to people who work with people at a very private level, if you talk to clinical psychologists and social workers and pastors and cops and nurses, people who have a chance to listen to people when they're speaking their mind, what you will see is that people, they're racist, they're sexist, they're superstitious, they're governed by their phobias, they're governed by their fears. People are not rational. We just aren't. And I really don't know how you're going to get them that way. I really don't. Especially if you're not going to try everything that the communists tried in terms of a totalitarian system. You want an illustration? Steve Jobs. Read Walter Isaacson's biography of Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs came down with pancreatic cancer, and lucky for him, it was a fairly treatable kind of pancreatic cancer. But to the horror of his friends and wife, Jobs decided not to have surgery to remove the tumor, which was the only acceptable medical approach. I really didn't want them to open my body, so I tried to see if a few other things would work, he told me years later with a hint of regret. Specifically, he kept to a strict vegan diet with large quantities of fresh carrot and fruit juices. To that regimen, he added acupuncture, a variety of herbal remedies, and occasionally a few other treatments he found on the internet or by consulting people around the world, including a psychic. For a while, he was under the sway of a doctor who operated a natural healing clinic in Southern California that stressed the use of organic herbs, fruit juices, frequent bowel cleansing, hydrotherapy, and the expression of all negative feelings. When Job discussed his diet treatments, you cannot resolve this without surgery and blasting it with toxic chemicals. Even the diet doctor, Dean Ornish, a pioneer in alternative and nutritional methods for treating diseases, took a long walk with Jobs and insisted that sometimes traditional methods were the right option. You really need surgery, Ornish told him. Jobs' obstinacy lasted for 9 months after his October 2003 diagnosis. Part of this was the product of the dark side of his reality distortion field. I think Steve has such a strong desire for the world to be a certain way that he wills it to be that way, Levinson speculated. Sometimes it doesn't work. Reality is unforgiving. The flip side of his wondrous ability to focus was his fearsome willingness to filter out things he did not wish to deal with. This led to many great breakthroughs, but could also backfire. He has that ability to ignore stuff that he doesn't want to confront, Powell explained. It's just the way he's wired. Whether it involves personal topics relating to his family and marriage, or professional issues relating to engineering or business challenges, or health or cancer issues, Jobs sometimes simply didn't engage. In the past, he was rewarded for what his wife called his magical thinking, his assumption that he would will things to be as he wanted, but cancer doesn't work that way. Powell enlisted someone close to him, including his sister, Mona Simpson, to try to bring him around. In July 2004, a CAT scan showed that the tumor had grown and possibly spread, and it forced him to face reality. Steve Jobs. He wasn't a Jehovah's Witnesses. He wasn't a Christian. He wasn't believing an ancient story. Or was he? This is how people are. This is how successful people are. This is how high status people are. This is how the demigods of our culture are, because Steve Jobs is pretty close to that. This is how people are. And, well, we're going to make him a rationalist. Never would have invented the iPhone. There's no serious plan or provable method by making people rational. There's little basis that this works for anyone. They have no rationalist, united, happy, uber-successful community to prove their theory. It has been tried. Now, Peterson will come back and say it has been tried, and, well, they'll come back and say it hasn't been tried, and don't you dare say communism. And then there's more social bullying. But even Steve Jobs couldn't pull it off. The next issue they have is the supernatural. Oh, the supernatural. The heart of the offense is often mentioned, or the assertion of the supernatural. I can talk to God. Well, what do they mean by supernatural? That's terribly difficult actually to define rationally. Some events or process that cannot be explained by a previously known or potentially knowable causality, even in theory. And again, see C.S. Lewis's The Whole Show. But the problem is, they can't begin the story of the universe without that. Because they're, by any definition, the Big Bang would be supernatural, because there's no pattern for it. And the whole story begins with one, and this is basically what Peterson says. The problem they have is that the current secular scientific cosmology today begins with an event that is non-repeatable, non-repeating, not to the best of our knowledge, non-predicted, and a unique event most often called the Big Bang, which no one can adequately account for by using any of the laws of nature, because it itself is a source of what people call the laws of nature. What this amounts to is, give us one miracle and we'll explain the rest. And then the point that I've been thinking about is recognizing the supernatural. And look at my video about flatland. Well, all you'd recognize if you were in flatland is lines growing larger and smaller. That's all you would see from within flatland. And it's only from this monarchical vision that we look down upon flatland that we would have a 3D monarchical vision, that we would have any idea of what perhaps a sphere entering into flatland would look like. Because what we usually just see are patterns. We see patterns, and we see enough of those patterns, and we ourselves call them laws of nature, and we use these as the basis for our predictions. We would notice a disruption in a normal pattern, but all our patterns are data sets, which are always limited. Now, they feel like good data sets to us, but when you look at, say, the weird revolution in terms of psychology, when they realized that all of the data sets that people were taking in terms of psychology tended to be from a rather limited set of cultures, and that other peoples around the world saw things in ways that made them test differently in these supposedly psychological tests, well, then they had a big problem. See, we presume these data sets into a monarchical vision, which has eternity, which is basically some static, imagined clean room situation, and then we say, we can make predictions in them. But that's basically what Newtonian mechanics does. Here are these data sets, here's what we predict, and given these aspects, this is what should happen. The problem is, we can't even assert all the givens we would need in order for these things to happen. Now, this is where the pragmatists roll in. Well, it's good enough so that it's working for us, and that's true, and that's good, and it's powerful, but it isn't everything, and it isn't perfect, and what we basically do is extrapolate and say, this is what we go with. It generally works, but we know that this prognostication is always limited by the data set. All you need is one piece of data that would destroy it, and that's always the great fear of one miracle explodes the entire thing. It's a terribly fragile thing. Part of the problem is we don't actually see causality. All we see are the patterns. Now, another offense that I often read in this are the offensive divine person. And this is, I think, really gets at another area of reactivity in this. That Hezekiah would have a personal relationship with God, and on the basis of this, God would change his administration of the history and physics. We find this offensive. I believe we deeply desire it as first persons. We might be offended that Hezekiah would have some relationship. We might be skeptical when somebody in our world claims such a relationship. We might be offended by it, but we dearly wish we had one. We dearly wish that every time our child was sick, all we would have to do is pray and God would hear all child. We dearly wish that I had the Midas touch so I could pick up an object and say, I need a little bit more money. Bang, it turns to gold. I take it down to the gold store. They cash me out. I dearly wish I had that power. We dearly wish we had God's power, but we don't. And so envy becomes a part of this, becomes a part of the offense. Now, the definition of God as pantheism comes in at this point, or even Peterson's axiomatic God, that, well, we have problems with Hezekiah believing he's got a personal relationship with this God and can make requests of this God. But what if we define God as everything that there is and the great cause of everything? And well, that's essentially pantheism. God is the sum total of all there is, but there's nothing extra of him. He doesn't act, and God is in fact impersonal. This, however, sets up the Pantheist Dilemma, and the Pantheist Dilemma is that pantheists keep trying to relate to this God instead of just being part of this God. And you have Verizon Lisa that I mentioned a few videos ago talking to the universe about whether she wants that LG Lucid phone from Verizon. And she's, thanks, universe. And the universe says, and by the way, Lisa, you look particularly lovely today. You have Luke Skywalker. Obi-Wan says, use the Force. But here's the thing. If the universe is fundamentally pantheistic and impersonal, any personal being colonizes the impersonal and employs it. essentially making the universe less powerful than anyone who can wield it. And you have this problem behind every kind of pantheistic conception of God. And I find pantheists blow the story again and again and again. And in the movie Avatar, they blew it as the climax of the movie. Yuwa has heard us, and suddenly Yuwa was fighting against the great evil humanoids coming in to get all of the unobtainium or whatever it was they were trying to mine. But pantheism, a pantheist deity, cannot take sides, because there are no sides, because it's all one. Now, better pantheists actually admit to this, and they say the universe is not personal, and neither are you, that your experience of personal is illusory, and so what you ought to do is get beyond, if in fact you can talk ought. And again, the better pantheists get beyond that, say there is no ought, there is only is. And the really consistent pantheists wouldn't bother with an argument, because there's no point to making an argument, because all there is. There's no ought. All there is. And the quicker you shed the illusion of personal agency, the clearer you see. But do you actually see? Because all there is. But isn't even this admonition assuming that which you assert is an illusion? And so, to me, the pantheist approach really goes nowhere, because what's the point? Once I realize all there is, there isn't good and evil, that my experience of talking and trying to persuade you is really just an illusion, because we're not even choosing either. So what's the point? And then, in a sense, the rational thing to do is to go to meditate, to finally absolve myself of the illusion of personal agency, and to join the great sea of being and oneness, and so on and so forth. That's essentially at the heart of pantheism. But then again, none of this makes it, it just is. Now, then you have the unwise God objection. And that says, now, let's imagine there was a God, and this God is the kind of being that could be responsible for making the universe. That God would have to be so amazingly brilliant, so amazingly powerful, and hopefully moral. That's always the big question. Via general revelation, we could say, you could see God's power, but you might have trouble seeing his goodness. And in fact, I remember, I think was it Eric Weinstein and Ben Shapiro's video where they talked about it was Ben Shapiro talking to Prager, talking about that. God's goodness, that's the tougher part that you need revelation for. We're going to talk about that a little bit too. Now let's imagine the atheists, just for the sake of argument, give us a personal supreme deity, and the pantheists give in to their impulse to talk to it. Why should such a deity even bother to get involved in the affairs of tiny, insignificant creatures such as ourselves? It's a good question. This is a very good question, and comes from an important realization. Given what we can know about such a being, based on what we can see in the universe, compared to such beings, we are weak, stupid, petty, and reasonably unimportant compared to such a being. Such a being could reasonably care less about us than we care about the common ants that inhabit the soil around our domiciles. Just Google the amount of ants sometime, and how many there are, and how all over the place they are. And every time we break ground or something, people don't stop and say, don't kill the ants. It's like, the ants are not an endangered species. We're not really worried about them. And when they invade our homes, we kill them regularly, and we don't give them a thought. At least if you're not, certain religions might want to protect the ants. But anyway, that we would concern ourselves with a personal relationship with individual ants and get involved in ant drama seems inconceivable. Well, maybe you're a child and you got involved in ant drama for 10 or 15 minutes, or maybe you had a little ant house and you were watching it, but okay. But really, ants are not the kind of thing that we can have an interesting relationship with. But here's the thing. part of the difficulty that we have is via consciousness we are monofocal. And I think Jonathan Pageau talks nicely about how, in a sense, we have order to chaos going out in terms of what we see. So we're monofocal, and consciousness has this function. We can really only pay attention to one thing at a time, and we have to, when we have to try and manage 2 or 3 things, this tiny little slice of our mind that manages our conscious rational self gets really stressed. And there's plenty of psychological testing that describes our limitation. But a God is not limited to this monofocal consciousness and awareness like we are. Being involved in taking sides in ant soap operas would be an irresponsible use of our time, but doing so for God is hardly a problem, because such a God apparently is not limited by the monofocal experience of consciousness that we have. So therefore, if God, for whatever reason, wanted to get involved in our little dramas and care about our little thought crimes, I suppose he could. Who am I to tell him he couldn't? See, God is free to do so if he chooses, but he's under no obligation to do so. Just like when you break ground on your new office building, you're not under any obligation to worry about those ants that you destroyed the first day with the backhoe. A reasonable ant, if they understand the qualitative difference between the beings, should offer a human being who takes an interest in them a variety of things. So let's imagine if an ant could even pay attention to the fact that a human being was taking interest in them, what would that ant owe the human being? Maybe the human being is feeding it. Now we can scale up to a dog or a cat and have a little bit better understanding, but an ant should at least owe, at least according to our standards, respect, obedience, even worship. If I were an ant and I realized I had an experience with a human being, as our cats and dogs do, I might begin to think, well, this is a being that I should cultivate a relationship with. This being could, let's think about my dog, this being could potentially feed me every day, shelter me, protect me, give me free health care, and in fact give me quite a bit longer of a life than I would have out in the wild. And in fact, if you look at my dog, human beings are extremely responsible for the shape of my little dog. My little dog would not be found in nature apart from any human being. They tell us that my dog came from wolf stock. If there's any dog that's different from a wolf, it's my dog. So a smart ant would cultivate a relationship with such a being. It would surely be in the ant's best interest to cultivate a relationship with a human being, especially one that has access to poison and earth-moving equipment. Now, let's imagine a human being is capable of getting involved in ant affairs, which would be immoral for an ant to make would it be immoral for an ant to make a request of a human being, and would it be immoral for the human being to satisfy that request even at the expense of the interests of other ants competing in the ant soap opera drama? So you've got a favorite ant, and you discover that your favorite ant's colony is at war with the colony 2 feet over, and you decide, hey, you know what I'd like to do? I'm going to get rid of the warring colony. And so I do, because I can, and I don't think a thing of it. And all the little ants are like, "Yay! We have a relationship with Paul Vanderklay, and he just poisoned the other ant economy. He just poisoned the competing ants." And then, of course, some of those ants we might think, well, of course, ants we don't believe, we don't have any reason to imagine ants have this capacity. But some of the ants might say, wait a minute, if he can destroy them, he could destroy us. And they might be in a little bit of fear from me, and they might think about ways that they'd like to not tick me off. And if they start invading my kitchen and I say, hey, I've made a good relationship with you guys, don't invade my kitchen, stay on your side of the line, well, maybe we would. None of this is irrational. But now we're holding God to a standard we don't hold ourselves to, because we don't have any moral objections to killing ants or disrupting their lives for the most part. We have less claim to authority over ants than God has over us, because we didn't actually make ants. Well, let's look a little bit at the problem of evil. And I was just listening to Veritas Forum, the Best of Veritas Forum, as a thing with Tim Keller on it. You can find on YouTube. Veritas Forum has Alvin Plantinga and the Problem of Evil. And actually, so Esther O'Reilly wrote a pathos piece on Jordan Peterson under the name Young Fogey, and an atheist wrote a response piece, and I noticed they trotted out the problem of evil. And as Tim Keller says, the problem of evil isn't really a philosophical objection, it's much more of a pastoral objection. It's something that we feel, because philosophically, it really isn't an objection to that there is a God. It isn't a philosophical objection. It's an emotional objection. But what's another interesting aspect about the problem of evil is it didn't really arrive until the early modern period. Before then, it was known to antiquity, but the problem didn't really have pastoral traction until we began to think of ourselves with a little bit more self-importance. And at that point, we became increasingly offended at what we would imagine the divine would do to us. In other words, part of what has fueled the concern of the problem of evil has not been so much ideas about God, but our ideas about ourself and the elevation of our ideas about ourself. And you can read about this in Tim Keller's good book on suffering. Now we have, again, in the story of Hezekiah, the God-playing charge. We have a moral objection that God would grant Hezekiah more life on the basis of favoritism. This is me killing the neighboring ant colony because my favorite ant lives over here, and I'm going to basically change ant history because I like this ant, and I like this ant for my own reason. And actually, that ant probably hasn't done much of anything to earn my allegiance or to demand my trust. The argument basically says that a just God should maintain moral objectivity, and if such a God establishes something like a law, then God is bound to uphold the law, and I think that has a degree of legitimacy. Hezekiah appeals to God on the basis of his moral performance in an attempt to gain relational leverage over that God. One of the things you might notice from the story itself, however, is that God does not say, Hezekiah has been so good to me, I'm in his debt, I'm going to give Hezekiah what he wants. Basically, and this is pretty consistent through the Old Testament, God measures his behavior according to himself more than our performance. So any law that this God would communicate to smaller creatures, to creatures smaller than ants, would be in keeping with the desire that that personal God has for its own creation. God has ideas about how we should live. God has ideas about how we should behave. Now, God could communicate to us some of those ideas and laws, or give us representations of those ideas via laws, but those laws would have to scale to things that we could understand, limited by our capacity to understand and by the specific cultures in which we inhabit. And that's why, again, I subscribe to an organic story of the Bible, organic theory of inspiration, that God worked through the cultures and the languages of specific times and places in creating the Bible. The Bible doesn't fall from out of the sky. Laws that could be managed and communicated to us would likely only be useful approximations of that will, of that God, of that, let's see, I try to read this stuff and it never quite comes off well. Basically, the idea is what I just articulated. You say, well, a good God would give us laws. Yeah, but those laws would be limited. The representation and articulation of those laws would be limited to our capacity to understand them and to maybe even try to comply with them. And I'm not going to get into the slavery conversation, but I think you can have a good conversation about why didn't God just outlaw slavery? I think that would be something akin to God outlawing the internal combustion engine and us trying to get rid of it, or God outlawing money. From now on, Christians shall not use money. Yeah, go ahead and try. This God can, in fact, pretty much do as he pleases, and any objection by ants could, of course, be heard in his freedom, but the capacity of the ants to stand in judgment over such a being is really quite preposterous. So the ants of my favorite ant would say, ooh, he really shouldn't have wiped out those other ants. And I would say, I would wipe them out for lesser reasons. Does that make me less good? We can't see that illustration in the relationship we have with your dog or your cat. The gulf is less in those animals, or even your child when you bring them in for vaccination or medical procedure. And this gets into Tim Keller and Alvin Plantinga and many other arguments to kind of blunt the argument, the philosophical argument of the problem of evil. The fact that you can't think of a good reason why God would allow certain painful things to happen in the world doesn't mean that there can't be good reasons that such a being can have. The little ants complaining about how you destroyed their entire community because you wanted to put up an office building. Well, we said, tough luck, ants. We're destroying your habitat so we can build this office building. And unlike certain other animals that we have concerns about they're rare animals, ants are not rare. We can lose a whole bunch of ants and we're not really too concerned about it. God is free to do what he wants with us in relationship, and we should probably assume that no matter how things look on our side of the line, God should have the integrity and freedom to do as he pleases, whether we regard such things as favorable to us or offensive. God's going to do what he wants. Now, a big objection that I would get is, you're just making stuff up. You don't have any evidence for this. Okay, we're back to evidentialism. And, well, I don't know that we have evidence one way or the other. I mean, in that way, I'm a pretty skeptical person. The real objection is that we are just making up stories and that this whole thing is just flights of fancy and that there's no objective truth to an imaginary system that we can employ to move the heart and get the results from the ant god. Fair enough. I have a great deal of sympathy for this objection. We want evidence. The heart of this objection is that we can turn relating to God into a science. And I think this is really where the Jordan Peterson conversation comes in, because, again, Peterson is making an argument from below, and he's saying, I'm not taking any of this stuff from above. I'm simply saying that I have evidence that all of these systems have worked really well for human beings, and that it's likely unwise that we throw them away. That all of these stories have in fact brought us to a pretty good place so far. And he's not excluding rationality. He's just saying these stories are playing a more important part in the success that we've experienced as a species than Sam Harris and others are accounting for. But I'd like to turn it around and notice that in many ways, this objection is all about our hearts, and it's about what we want. Because what we'd really like is science. And as I said before, we might hate the idea that God would do this for Hezekiah, but we dream that there would be such a being who would do it for us. And all the little ants are dreaming that they could build a relationship with a human being. And our dogs and our cats, they don't even have the conscious ability to think this far, but in many ways, they are far better off, often against their will. And again, I have this all the time. Every time I take my little dog into the vet, which is way too often, every time I take my little dog into the vet, guess what? That little dog hates to go, and he hates the vet, and he hates the examinations, and he hates all of this. And if that dog could be given speech, well, he barks, and he complains, and he whines, and he communicates to me very clearly that he objects to all of this. But I walk into the vet's office with that dog, and that vet does all kinds of things to that dog. And you know what? In my estimation, the dog is better for it. And it's pretty hard to argue with it. Now, what would my dog like? My dog would like for me to be its master, and it tries to make me its master all the time. And someone might say he arguably does, because every time that doggone dog wants to go outside, he goes to the door and he paws on the window, and I get my lazy butt off the couch watching TV, and I slide that door open, and I slide it closed to keep out the mosquitoes. Then the dog wants to come back in, and I slide it open, and I slide it shut. And I do this how many times? And I pay real money for that dog to go to the vet. And I pay real money to feed that dog. And on and on and on and on and on. And so you begin to wonder who's governing who. But what that dog would really like is to turn the relationship into science. And what we really hate about the Hezekiah story is that Hezekiah gets what he wanted. And when I prayed for a loved one, God didn't answer. Could there be a motivation at work here? We don't want people praying unless it works. Because if for a minute we could turn this prayer thing into a science, believe you me, all of this objection would go away and we would use it as much as we could. That's really what's at the heart of this. When I say a science, I mean a system that we can employ to first predict and then ensure, that's technology basically, the outcomes we desire. What this does is in fact depersonalize God. This is the attraction of pantheism, because we as persons would have power over it, the power to colonize it, reducing God and making God subject to our wills and desire. This is not much different from the way many pantheists cheat their system. The perfect pantheist finally surrenders their agency because in their system it itself must be illusory and behavior consistent with such a worldview. Rationality is a consistency effort, practices the destruction of one's personal will and one's personal agency. Rationally, your ethics should align with your larger worldview. Even if Hezekiah believes that God has placed Hezekiah in his debt, God is under no obligation to act as if he's in Hezekiah's debt one way or another. Now, my little dog probably many ways imagines that I am in his debt, but I do not feel in the debt of my dog to the least. And much to my family's fear, there will come a day when I'll go to the vet and the vet says, well, I'll save your dog for $10,000. And I'll say, I love my little dog, but I'm putting the dog down because I cannot afford a $10,000 vet bill. I'm going to put my little dog down. And you'd say, well, I don't believe you. I've done it before and I'll do it again. Why? Because it's rational. But what does my little dog think of this? Well, we don't know, really, but we can imagine pretty well what my little dog thinks of this. My little dog would love me to be his master, to love to have a master as powerful as a human being is, with as much capacity as I have. And we see this with children. The same thing happens with toddlers and a parent. A parent might relent to the toddler's plea, but the parent is never really in the toddler's debt. God remains free to do as he wants, and we remain small, and this we really hate. Now, should God manage the universe in a way that would yield clear and consistent results? Let's say God would say, okay, I'm going to institute a new regime of giving people exactly what they want when they ask for it. And again, I would recommend reading C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce, because in C.S. Lewis's picture, hell is a place that you get everything you ask for just by thinking of it. Every prayer is answered, but the one thing you can't do is violate someone else's will, which is why heaven is this, or hell is this enormous city that just keeps growing and everyone keeps moving further and further and further away from each other in increasingly fabulous houses, getting everything they want, but the one thing that they can't stand is each other. So should God manage the universe in a way that would give clear and consistent results? Let's say God would say, watch, and you can even watch, what was that Jim Carrey movie where Bruce Almighty, there you go. God just decides he's going to grant every prayer. Well, this would be problematic for reasons that it shouldn't take too long for us to see. But what if God, assuming I'm right about this, made it so that prayer for people get what they want, if such a thing could be measured, on a consistent basis, so that prayer works to a degree that even Sam Harris would start to pray for a Lamborghini or for whatever it is he wanted? And this is an interesting question, because would it be in God's interest to do so, or would this simply make us more mercenary, and would this in fact poison the kind of relationship that we can, without too much difficulty, imagine God would like to have with us? This gets into Jordan Peterson's ideas about sacrifice, because Peterson says that people saw that sacrifice worked. And this is complicated for Peterson because sacrifice is tied to delaying gratification and engagement with the future beyond animals, and the future is filled with people, so you have shared rationality. Religion is a powerful adaptive force in the development of human culture, so why should we imagine that now we don't need it anymore? That's at the heart of Peterson's objection. But what would it take, and would it in fact be in God's interest to answer all of our prayers, or at least a sufficient quantity of our prayers, so that they, number one, wouldn't be hurtful to others, and number two, would give us a clear and consistent pattern that even atheists would have to go back and say, yep, we should pray? Well, first, we don't actually know whether this prayer of Jordan Peterson's sacrifice really works. It's terribly difficult to run an experiment, partly because for an experiment to work, you would have to make sure that God would be blind to your experiment. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, imagine a group of kids trying to run such an experiment on the manipulation of their parents. So you've got some siblings and they get together and they say, you know, I really noticed that Dad is vain. And so when we say sweet things to Dad, Dad, you look good today. Oh, you're such a good father. Oh, we're so thankful, that we tend to get what we want more. So we as children are basically going to conspire and work on Dad's vanity to get our requests answered more often. Well, this might go for a while, and depending on the vanity of your father, it might work pretty well. But once your father figures out that this is a game and that you're not actually authentically praising him, but you're manipulating him, the deal is done, because your father doesn't want to have a relationship like this with you. And if he does, he's not a very good father. So you'd have to keep this experiment blind to God. Well, there you have a problem. Once the parents knew what the kids were up to, the parents would then start to mess with the results according to their will. So if the kids think that they can play on me with my vanity, well, once I know this, now I'm going to think the other way. And then we're into spy versus spy. And we're into reasons why it's terribly hard to predict the stock market, because it's filled with human beings. So is God managing us? Well, if I had an ant friend, I'd manage that. I manage my dog. I manage my cat. I managed my children when they were young. They're a whole lot smarter now, but they're not quite as smart as me because I'm old and I've seen a few things, and they don't watch my videos. Well, we have reason to believe that God might not wish to run the universe in such a way that he would be subject to our whims in some sort of compulsory way. Parents can, for their own sake, make themselves subject to the whims of a child, but the good and responsible parent would never make themselves ultimately subject to those whims. And I don't make myself ultimately subject to the whims of my dog. Now we get into my Calvinism. How long is this? It's about an hour. That's not too bad. God is holy, holy, and unimaginably free. And to me, this is utterly rational. Now, can I prove it? No, because it's built on my presuppositions. But to me, given the Christian presuppositions, God is far beyond what we can imagine, because the deeper we, watch again that Neil deGrasse Tyson video, the deeper we dig into knowledge, the more we realize we don't know. And the cosmological argument that there is a designer continues to have pull on me. Does it prove anything? I don't know what we can prove, but to me the universe seems like such a place that, wow, it is amazing, it is complex, it seems designed and fine-tuned. But such a being capable of that is degrees different from myself to my toddler, and myself to my dog, and myself to ants. And so, to the degree that any such being would like to relate to me, that's on that being and not me. He can destroy me about as quickly as any earth mover destroys an ant colony. That's just the way it seems to me. And to me, this is utterly rational. We are small and have zero capacity to put God in our debt. And if you go back and you listen to the history of my sermons, you'll hear this theme again and again and again, because I think just as it's built into my dog, just as it's built into the toddlers, just as it's built into my children, just as it's built into almost any human relationship. One of the things that husbands and wives are continually wrestling about, and what the Old Testament says, what is our relationship with God? We wrestle with God. What are we always trying to do? We're trying to put God in my debt because I want to put a being like God in my debt so that I can be God. Because if I can put God in my debt, and if I can have a special relationship with God, and if I get in a fix, then God can get me out. Moralistic therapeutic deism. Look it up. And we are offended by the idea that King Hezekiah would lay there and Isaiah would say, yeah, you're going to die. And Hezekiah would turn to the wall and say, I don't want to die. And God would listen to him. And God would say, okay, Isaiah, go back and tell him you get 15 more. Why is this offensive? Because we asked and didn't get any more. Because the universe seemed to hurt us at the moment of our need. And when I look at it this way, what do I see? I see what is consistently human, that we are petty, small creatures who don't know squat about just about anything. This is how we are. And so the idea that we could have a relationship with a God who would listen to us and care about us, well, this is attractive. Is that an argument why it might all be fantasy? You bet it is. I might be fooling myself. I get that. But to me, none of this is irrational. To me, all this is plenty rational from where I started. And I don't have any hope in their rational project. In fact, we've been working the system of rationality for thousands of years. Now, any ability to relate to such a being is completely dependent upon this being's his desire to do so. Consider the ant. This being owes us nothing. That is a terrifying thought. The universe, the world is a terrifying place. We have zero possibility to put God in our debt. We are trying to do so, and trying to do so is believably offensive. When your toddler tries to put you in your debt, in his debt, it's kind of cute because you're old enough to know. When your teenager does it, it becomes a learning experience to reinforce to the teenager, you know, I love you, I'm good to you, I take care of you, I'm sacrificing a lot for you, don't try to pull those strings on me. When your adult children do it, that gets really offensive because they should know better. But we do it all the time to each other. We do it to our spouses. Look at almost any marital situation. Look at almost any intimate human situation. It's this ongoing tug of war of trying to put the other in our debt so that we can have control and turn the other people into a science. So we can turn them into piano keys so we can play them. But the thought that we ourselves as our piano keys, whichever system you come at this from, that's offensive to us. We don't like it. We hate it. We don't want it. So what's our motivation? We have zero possibility to put God in our debt. Trying to do so is believably offensive. We don't like it when our children do it to us. So there you have Hezekiah's illness. God is free in the situation consistently. He can change his mind or even just appear to change his mind. He is not indebted to our systems of thinking about him. Because our systems are always representations and attempts at approximating. Even God revealing himself, John Calvin says this, he has to accommodate himself to us, to talk with us within a frame of reference. Look at my Dimensions video about Flatland. When you think about how I need to condescend to train my dog. Why? Because my dog has limited bandwidth. Because and it's even hard for me because God sees through us in a way that I can't see through my dog. But look at the degree of power between myself and my dog. McGilchrist says the dog's brain has about as many neurons as we have in our guts. Okay? Yeah. Look at how much we have to condescend. And I don't mean that in the emotional sense. I mean that in the more historical sense. we have to condescend to talk to my dog. No, no, sit, stay. I can't even do that with an ant. Think about what God has to do to talk to us. And yeah, you're objecting to a Bible that was written to another culture, a culture you can hardly understand. The miracle is that anything works at all. And again, this is part of the reason I like Peterson. He makes that point again and again, and I think he's dead right. That's the miracle. The miracle is that any of this works. The miracle is that we would even imagine or try to have a relationship with a being like this. Most of our ancestors didn't even bother trying because even that seemed too audacious and ambitious. God is free in the situation completely. He can change his mind or even appear to change his mind. We don't know, and it's pointless to judge. What's God's concern, might we imagine? Not to make the people more mercenary in their relationship with him, not to encourage the manipulation which is so inherent in us. You know, you think about the fact that the atheists say religious belief is irresponsible. I understand the point. I really do. I've got a lot of sympathy for them. But you think about how irresponsible it is on God's part to relate to us at all. You know, if you relate to animals at all, maybe keep them wild. But to relate to us at all, why? What does he want to do with us? Well, he wants to make us better. Well, what would be the definition of better? Well, the only definition we can come up with is more like him. What do we do with our pets? What do we do with our children? We want to make them more like us. We don't want to destroy their individuality, but we want to make our children both more like us, but in the individual way. And this parent-child, this human dog, this human ant, these analogies just keep working and scaling with respect to this. But he wants us to relate to him freely, and that we know ourselves to be what we are. He doesn't want us to have pretenses about, we can construct this world. And again, Peterson reads this, I think, correctly in the Bible, that we are full of pretense, and this pretense is in fact dangerous. What he really wants is for us to learn to trust and find his joy. Well, what's going on our side? It's all trust and control. We lack trust and we want control. And again, I'll assert we're not so much offended that Hezekiah, that there would be a situation that someone would pray and their prayers would be answered, but that ours aren't. We are so dramatically self-interested. We so want the world to be as we imagine it should be. We lack trust and we want control. But how trustworthy are we? What exactly are we trying to secure? Can't answer those questions. So there's about an hour and 12 minutes of ranty video, but those are random scattered thoughts as I think about the Hezekiah story, and I think about the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris conversation. And again, for me, this is, why do I keep talking about this? Why do I keep making these videos? Well, this is just how I'm wired. Maybe I'm, not in control of myself nearly as much as I imagine I am. But when I read the Hezekiah story, I thought, this is exactly the kind of thing that, if I wanted to sit down and debate an atheist, I'd say, let's start with this story. And it would be just, let's softball, just a lobbed softball over the middle of the plate, because here it's got all the elements, and they'd say, surely a rational person can't believe this. And on one hand, I completely understand their complaints because I see it all the time. But yet on the other hand, I don't find it irrational at all. I don't know how they're going to change me to this lauded rationality that's supposed to dispel God and every part of magical thinking that Steve Jobs lost his life over. But here we are.